Tell me if this sounds familiar. You finish a book, a really good one, the kind that leaves you sitting with it for a few days after, where you're still thinking about a character's decision while you're making coffee, or a sentence surfaces in your brain randomly at 2 a.m., and you lie there thinking about what it means. And then, weeks later, or maybe months, or maybe years, you pick it up again. You already know what happens. You know who survives, who doesn't, how it ends, what the twist is, which paragraph is going to make you cry. You know all of it. And you read it anyway. And somehow, it hits just as hard. Sometimes harder. Now here's the thing. Most people around you probably think this is a little odd. There are so many books you haven't read, they say, with genuine confusion. Why go back to one you already know? And you've probably tried to explain it, and probably failed, because there isn't an easy explanation for it, not one that sounds rational to someone who hasn't felt it. But there is an explanation, a deep one. And that's exactly what we're doing today. Because rereading is not a quirk. It's not inefficiency or nostalgia dressed up as a reading habit. The psychology behind it is genuinely fascinating, and it says something very specific about how your mind works, how you process emotion, and what you're actually doing when you return to a world you already know. So let's go there. The first thing we need to dismantle is the idea that reading is fundamentally about acquiring information. This framing dominates how most people think about books, especially in productivity culture. Read it, absorb the knowledge, move on to the next one. Books treated like nutritional supplements, one a week for optimal intellectual health. And within that framework, rereading makes no sense whatsoever. You've already absorbed the information. Why take the same supplement twice? But this framework misses something so fundamental that it almost inverts the truth. For the people who reread, reading was never primarily about information. It was always about experience. The emotional arc, the feeling of being inside a specific consciousness or world, the way a particular author's sentences feel in your mind, their rhythm, their specific texture, the angle from which they see things. None of that is information. All of it is experience. And you don't watch a film that moved you once and then never again. You don't listen to an album that mattered to you only once. The expectation that books should be consumed linearly and never returned to is a modern, productivity-adjacent idea that simply doesn't match how meaningful art actually functions in a human life. So if rereading is about experience, the real question is, what kind of experience is it providing? And why does it feel different, sometimes more profound, than the first read? This is where psychology gets genuinely interesting. There's a concept called the mere exposure effect, first identified by psychologist Robert Zajonc in 1968, which found that humans develop a preference for things simply through repeated exposure. The more we encounter something, the more favorably we tend to feel toward it. But rereading isn't just exposure, it's something richer than that. What rereading actually produces is what researchers call a fluency effect. The brain processes familiar material more smoothly, with less cognitive effort spent on tracking plot or decoding prose, which frees up something much more valuable: attention. When you reread, your conscious mind is no longer working to figure out what's happening. And that means it can go somewhere else. It can go deeper. Think about what this means practically. On a first read, your brain is doing significant work just staying oriented in the story. Who is this character? What does this mean? What happened before? You're tracking narrative threads, building the world model, staying alert for new information. But on a reread, all of that scaffolding is already built. The world model exists. The characters are known. And without the cognitive load of construction, you can finally just live there. You notice the sentences you rushed past the first time. You catch foreshadowing that was invisible when you didn't know the ending. You feel the emotional weight of a scene fully, rather than processing it while simultaneously managing the anxiety of not knowing what comes next. In a very real sense, a first read is reconnaissance. A reread is when you actually arrive. And there's something else happening emotionally that's worth slowing down for. When you return to a beloved book, you're not returning to the text alone. You're returning with everything you've experienced since the last time you read it. Psychologists talk about how emotional memories accumulate around meaningful objects and experiences, and a book that has mattered to you becomes, over time, a kind of emotional archive. Every time you open it, you're not just reading the story. You're reading all your previous encounters with it. The person you were when you first read it. The things you were going through at the time. The way it felt then versus the way it feels now. The book becomes a record not just of its own story, but of yours. This is why people often describe rereading a childhood favorite as vertiginous. You're meeting the same words you first met at 14, but you're meeting them from inside a completely different life. And the gap between who you were and who you are becomes suddenly, vividly present. Researcher Christelle Russell, who has studied media consumption and re-engagement, found that people revisit meaningful media specifically to reconnect with past versions of themselves, to maintain psychological continuity, a thread of selfhood through all the changes life produces. The book doesn't change. That's exactly why it can show you how much you have. Let's talk about what happens specifically when life gets hard, because this is one of the most consistent patterns researchers have found in rereading behavior. People return to beloved books disproportionately during periods of stress, grief, transition, and uncertainty. And this isn't escapism in the pejorative sense. It's something more psychologically sophisticated. When the world feels unstable, the known and beloved provides something very specific: predictability. You know how this story goes. You know the character survives. You know where the arc lands. In a life that might currently feel directionless or frightening, the familiar book offers what therapists sometimes call a corrective emotional experience, a place to feel the full range of emotion: fear, grief, hope, catharsis, in an environment where you know you will come through it. There's a reason people in acute grief often describe being unable to read anything new, but returning compulsively to books they've read before. New narratives require cognitive and emotional investment with an unknown payoff. The grief brain doesn't have the bandwidth for that. But the familiar book? It asks nothing of you except to return, and it gives you everything it always gave you, reliably, without requiring you to orient yourself in new terrain. This is what a security object actually is. Not a weakness, not a crutch, but a stabilizing resource that allows the nervous system to process difficult experience in a context of guaranteed safety. Now here's a dimension of rereading that almost no one talks about, and I think it might be the most interesting one. Every time you reread a book, you are not the same reader. You've aged. You've been through things. Your understanding of relationships has changed, your relationship to mortality, your experience of loss or love or failure. And because the book is fixed, because the words are exactly as they were, it becomes a kind of measuring instrument. You can see yourself in it, not because the book reflects you, but because it doesn't change, and you do. The book becomes the constant against which your own movement through life becomes visible. Literary scholar Naomi Jacobs wrote about how rereaders often report experiencing a single book as if it were multiple different books, one for every life stage they brought to it. What you find in a novel at 22 is categorically different from what you find in the same novel at 40. The text hasn't changed, but the questions you're bringing to it have changed entirely. When you were 22, you read it asking, "Who am I? What is possible?" When you return at 40, you might read it asking, "Was it worth it? What do I still want?" The book answers different questions at different times, not because it contains different answers, but because you're finally asking the questions that were always latent in it, waiting for the version of you ready to receive them. This is why some books reward rereading in a way that others simply don't. A purely plot-driven novel burns through most of its energy on the first read. The engine is surprise, and once surprise is spent, there isn't much left to return to. But a book with psychological depth, with prose that operates on multiple levels, with characters whose interior lives continue to reveal themselves across time, that book is, in a sense, infinite. Each visit is a new dialogue between a fixed text and an evolving reader. And here's the final thing I want to say about this, because I think it reframes the whole behavior in a way that matters. Rereading is an act of return, and return requires knowing where home is. In a culture that valorizes the new, the next book, the next experience, the next version of yourself, the rereader is doing something quietly countercultural. They are insisting that some things are worth going back to, that the deepening of a known thing has value, the discovery of an unknown one doesn't, that you don't always need to move forward. Sometimes the most meaningful direction is back and deeper. If you're someone who rereads, you are not behind. You are not avoiding the new. You are practicing something that most of the modern world has forgotten how to do, staying with something long enough to fully understand what it means. That's not a small thing. That's actually quite rare. So what's the book you've returned to most? The one whose spine is cracked, whose pages you know by heart, whose world still feels like home every time you step back into it? Drop it in the comments. I genuinely want to know. And if this video felt like the explanation you never quite had for something you've always done, subscribe. Because this is what we do here at the Psych Spot every single week. We go into the real stuff. See you next time.